let's bring this meeting of the Board Policy Committee for January 4th, 2021 into session. We have, I think, all of the board members. We have Jackson Weinberg here. Do you know if Jillian is here? Is she coming?
She won't be able to make it.
She won't. Okay. All right. So we have again a very full agenda. So I'm just going to leap right in if there are no objections. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 policies that we're going to be considering to one degree or another this afternoon. The first one is the preservation, maintenance, and disposition of real district property policy. And you should all have received a new version with some substantial edits to the preamble and some edits to the text. We've talked about this a number of times in this committee, and there is great interest in moving this out of the committee to as soon as we can, and the preference is for us to forward this on to the full board by the end of today's meeting, if that's possible. But I think Liz has some commentary from staff about the changes that were made and some clarifying questions from staff. So
yes, so thank you. So I don't need to speak for Dana and Kirsten and Dan because they are here, but I am here to help facilitate if that's of use to anyone. And I think the only intro I would say is that I think the questions they've raised in response to this current draft are really thoughtful about how this gets operationalized and how they apply it to requests that come in, even if the board is ultimately the decision maker, which will be the case sometimes, but perhaps not all the time, depending on the thresholds. Do they have a clear understanding of what the board is intending with certain definitions or certain language? And so I think it's really helpful to get that clarification now. I guess the other category is in some instances, the questions may provide clarity for how to draft an AD that is implementing the intent of the board ultimately. So with that, Dana, I don't know if you're taking the lead, or Kirsten or Dan, but I will hand it over to the people who really know what it means to put this into action.
I can jump in, and then hopefully somebody will save me if I start to drown. One question that comes up is the definition of a PPS. Does that mean a student who is enrolled with PPS or who is eligible to be enrolled in PPS? That's a question that I think is going to continue to come up, and we need some clarification on that.
So I'm referring to, I just want to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. So this is the presumption of market terms section.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Director Moore. It's the presumption of market terms section, and we're speaking about serving PPS students. Are we talking about any student that could be a PPS student, which is sort of how, for example, the county defines in our health clinics, or are these students that are enrolled with PPS?
Well, I think based on our previous conversations, my response to that would be, I think we're intending it to mean students currently enrolled in a PPS school or a PPS charter school? Anybody have a different recollection?
I don't think we defined it, so I don't have that assumption. And I think I actually understood it to be any student, regardless of whether they're enrolled in PPS or not.
Oh,
I had the same interpretation as Rita did. It's my understanding based on all of our previous conversations.
because if we did not specify a direct connection to PPS, then that bullet point has no meaning.
Yeah, to me, I agreed. To me, it's only meaningful. I mean, I think we're trying to make the connection of like, this is that we add a criteria because of its connection to PPS.
I'm not opposed to that. But this gets kind of into the whole question of who are our students, and whether we mean that, really broadly in terms of kids are all our kids, regardless of where they attend school. They're part of our community. And whether we can neatly say, oh, we don't have to worry about those kids. I just want to raise that as a question that we deal. I think it's a great question from staff. Thank you. And we should be explicit about it. And I don't have my mind made up one way or another.
So I feel pretty strongly that we have I think we have a fiduciary, just my opinion, a fiduciary responsibility to use our assets, whether financial or capital facilities, in service to students who are in the PPS system, and we're PPS board members. So I would want us to stay focused on those who are our students, either directly or by a charter, or that some other entity has a contractual relationship with PPS to serve students. But I don't see us like a student who's in a non-PPS school who lives within the PPS boundaries as that we utilize our assets to, provide a financial benefit to them.
I agree with Julia.
I disagree. I think that students who have opted out opt out for a lot of reasons, and I think that they're ultimately still PPS students, and that there are some schools who can offer and do things in ways we can't right now. And so that I think our goal is about serving students, and it's about the impact of education on the community. And so I think doing things that benefit students that are not currently attending a PPS school would fall into the category of our students for me if they live within PPS boundaries.
So just like for example, a student at, say, if Catlin Gable saw an empty, I'm just using an empty school, or they were renting a facility and requested reduced market rent, or we're going to use this provision to make an offer for a facility, we would consider them PPS, their students PPS students?
Are we talking about number, I thought we were talking about C. Am I correct? on this that says the community being served by the other party includes a substantial portion of underserved students, students of color,
No.
students whose family qualify for free or reduced lunch, students with special needs, emerging bilingual students, and LGBTQ students?
No,
I think it's D.
we're talking about the official connection. We're trying to define the connection.
I think the point is that Catlin Gable might qualify under D, but not under C.
Yeah, or maybe another example would be Riverdale is and this is maybe where we get to the, the combination of criteria, but for example, Riverdale students, they, at the current Riverdale High School, are those PPS students or are those Riverdale students? And to me, I'd want to just be clear that our assets are, and to the benefit of students who are actually enrolled in PPS in some way, whether directly through our students, through a contracted program, or a charter that has been granted by PPS.
Can I ask Liz a legal question? Do we have any issues? Gable, Julia came to my mind as well, and Riverdale is a very real example because we're doing that right now. But that's a public entity. So in like the Catlin Gable or a private school example, do we have any issues around inuring to the benefit of a private organization with public money? Does that matter? Are we okay to say? Does that make sense?
It does, and it may be a longer conversation. I think the reality is that how our rents are set and what is market has a lot of play in it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're thinking about abating, I don't think PPS is forbidden from striking a negotiated deal with a tenant that because the market conditions have changed. So the extraordinary conditions, for instance, but it has to make those decisions on non-discriminatory, consistent criteria.
Well, maybe to complicate it just a little bit more, I think we had sort of three questions. The second one was, when we're looking at the presumption of market terms and the reduction of rent, are we looking at which is that there's some extraordinary event, whether that's to all of us, like a pandemic, or to that specific group, maybe they lose funding, whatever that might be, and the way that the policy currently reads, it's or a combination of factors. So could they be requesting the rent, that they want a rent abatement or rent reduction because they're a public entity, or because they serve a specific group of students? Does it have to also include the extraordinary economic issue, or is it any one of these things?
Is that a threshold qualifier, as we were
Right,
talking about, right? Is it 1 plus, or is it A plus
Right.
some combination of B through E, or could you have B through E without A?
Right. Thank you.
That's a great question. That's should be answered. I had just a sort of a secondary question in that same lineup around the combination of, is our requirement that it be a strong, when you do the net, a strong yes, or just it nets out to the combination, they would qualify or do we want it to be a strong positive of, yes, there's a strong case to be made that they would qualify? Because you could have a situation in which it's sort of like, well, you meet maybe 2 of the criteria, but actually it's not necessarily a strong net positive to PPS.
My understanding, this actually might help us come back around with the first question. And again, great questions from staff. My understanding is that we would only reduce rent below market value on a short-term basis, so that A is necessary threshold. And then if we got a request because there were some extraordinary things going on, then we would look at the other criteria, including that whole, is there a financial need on the part of the organization demonstrated? And I think that's also a criteria, a threshold criteria. And then we would look at the further cost benefits in terms of student impact and the impact on our budget as well. And if there's agreement on that, then I think it'll help us if we come back around to that first question. Does that, I'm curious if other committee members agree with that approach, and I include our students want to weigh in as well. So I saw a nod from Ailey.
I'm sorry, Scott, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, so my view is that if we're looking at the A, B, C, D, E, that actually we should eliminate A as a, and make that part of the main body to say, if there's something extraordinary going on, we would consider offering below market rate. And if the lessee demonstrates that they are in financial crisis, both of those are necessary before we would consider below market rents on a temporary basis. And then let me switch back and make sure I've got my alphabet right. And then let's see. So all of that is in A. And then B, C, D, and E become factors that we would weigh. Does that make sense, Julia?
Yes, but I think we also should recognize that we already do have some, that this isn't the only case in which we would provide below market rate, because we already provide below market rates for some.
Okay, so that gets back to, is it our intent policy-wise to offer long-term subsidies?
Well, my understanding of this particular policy is that we're trying to address sort of a short, maybe a different issue. Which is a short-term extreme set of circumstances.
Well, that's, I mean,
I think both cases are part of this policy. So we need to be really clear as to what we're talking about here. And again, thanks to staff for
making it harder.
no, for it's going to make it easier for us down the
road. So a follow-up question to that, Director Bailey, maybe is what does temporary, is that 6 months? Is that a year? Is that something that maybe is, does the board decide that at the time? Maybe it's based on a request.
how about if we call it time limited rather than temporary? And then stipulate that any express finding has to stipulate what the time limit is.
And I think that first sentence after sub E gets to that point. It doesn't mean we can't revise that or other language, but I think that was the intent previously stated by the committee.
So
we could put in a clause that says something about along the lines of 2 years. That's not an ironclad, but gives an indication of what we would in general consider. Or we could just leave it as is.
depends how much leeway you want to give future boards.
I think one of the things that AJ and Council of Great City Schools has said, you know, the bigger the bowl for policy, the better, because we don't know what all the things are going to be in the future. So that's just something I think we should keep in mind.
I don't know if it's helpful to think about this, and Dana and Kirsten weigh in, but I mean, I think a tenant making a request would also put forth their best case for the time period that it was needed in response to the extraordinary circumstances. And that may not define what's actually granted, but that there's a certain, the applicant makes the case for what's needed and for how long. And it certainly is not, under the policy as drafted, it's no more than the remainder of the lease, and it could be less than that.
I think that would make sense, and staff would be able to recommend that maybe it's 6 months or a year or 2 years or whatever that is. I'm assuming that wouldn't preclude that tenant or group from coming back again at the end of that time if circumstances, you know, for example, the pandemic's gone on much longer than any of us thought it was going to. So it's not just a one-time only application, right?
And the AD could spell out with greater detail what's to be submitted.
Right, right.
So would that work for both the kind of extraordinary circumstances we're all thinking of with the pandemic and situations where we have, prior to the pandemic, we had offered less than market terms? Would this language cover both circumstances?
So Rita, if we go back to the opening of presumption of market terms, we do carve out, and it's the point that Julia raised, we do carve out that we can adopt a resolution that makes an express finding that there's significant benefit to the districts and the communities it serves. So that's that's the room that says, the language that says we can do a one-off that's a longer term subsidy if there's a finding of that benefit. Otherwise, we're going to require some kind of emergency. And here's the factors that we'll raise. So if we're talking about that kind of emergency, then I think it would clarify that we make the A clause part of the main clause, and then B, C, D, and E are the factors that we weigh.
So we would revise that paragraph about the express finding, because I think right now the express finding that confers a significant benefit to the district is linked to the factors, which is linked to them being considered equally. So I want to make sure, Scott, that we get the language right to reflect the intent, which we can do. I just want to make sure I understand the substance. So, which would mean there are exceptional circumstances under these criteria where A becomes part of the threshold, but the board, of course, has the authority to make a finding outside of an exceptional circumstance, is what I'm hearing you say, if there is substantial, confers significant benefit to the district and the communities it serves. Which is probably, I mean, again, first of all, what is market and how that shifts over time? It's not without definition, but it also has a wider berth than some other definitions. But it may also be although not stated specifically in an express finding under a policy, may underlie why those decisions have been made in the past. I'm speculating, but they're usually not made without some rationale, right?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm flirting with wordsmithing here, but the clause where it says, unless the board adopts a resolution that makes an express finding of the transaction confers significant benefit. I think if we're going to compress those two thoughts, I think we might want to say, I think we might want to link the unusual circumstances and the significant benefit. Like, just to underscore that this is not the normal sort of thing. This is not what we're going to do on a regular basis. That it's got to be both unusual and substantially beneficial to the interests of the district and the students it serves. Does that make sense?
And is that when we go to the threshold factors? Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
So A would, so we're talking about moving A up into the paragraph, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it could be, so there may be unusual circumstances that are not linked to the financial stuff. I don't know. You're gonna need some wordsmithing to collapse those, but in principle, I agree. If that helps, does that help in any way?
I think it helps if we have consensus among the committee members.
Okay.
That's a diplomatic answer.
So let's see if we can sort of close a loop on this one. Are we agreed to take A out of the bullet points and move it into the first paragraph, the kind of explanatory paragraph. At the allow our legal eagles to wordsmith it. Any objection?
Well, let me, so are we still going to allow, going back to that second sentence or whatever it was, which could imply that we do a special resolution when there is no financial emergency, or where we just say, hey, this is for the best for our students. And that's not some special circumstance that just happened that we're in the middle of. So I'm still thinking we should we should have one or two sentences that are much more of a long-term outlook and not due to special circumstances, and the rest around it. Something happened, and if these factors are satisfied, we would consider making a below market lease for a time specified.
Okay, but so let me ask you, absent say C or D, where the students are underserved, and there's an official connection, which we still need to define. If do you want the ability of boards to be out of compliance with this general principle with no restrictions or with some restrictions? Because if you separate the non-COVID, let's just call it what we're, if you separate the non-COVID reductions in lease rates, and you attach no criteria, that's basically a blank check. A board can make a decision to give somebody a cut rate lease for whatever.
Well, we've certainly done that.
And do we want to continue that with no criteria?
No, I don't think we want to do that. I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to be strategic about these things and make sure that we're saying we need to thoughtfully consider criteria before we make major economic decisions that impact the district.
So I think we want to keep the two things linked. We want this policy to address both truly extraordinary circumstances and the unusual circumstance of giving a below market rate lease when we're not in a pandemic. Yeah, Scott, yes. Okay, so okay, so for A, I think it's going to take some wordsmithing. So Liz and Mary, would you be okay at this point if we hand that off to you? Okay, we haven't finished with this section, but at least that piece of it. Yeah.
Liz would be happy to take it on.
Okay.
I love you, Mary. Yes, I'd be happy to take it on.
She can do it in her spare time. So yeah. Okay. Let's go to the other bullet points that are the factors to be considered, right? So B is the costs and or benefits to the district of offering below rate terms. I was reading this over again today, and that one leapt out at me because that's not really a criterion. That's an explanation of what the express finding needs to be. So I think we might need to wordsmith that as well.
Yeah, so what I think if you were talking about a criteria, Rita, you would want it to be that it has a significant benefit to the district or its students. And as part of the sort of staff explanation or assessment, it would look at the costs, but the criteria I would think is that it have a significant benefit to PPS or its students.
And that the benefits outweigh the costs, both short-term and long-term.
Right, this gets to the net
Yeah.
question that I raised.
Does that make sense, Liz?
It does. I think in my conversations with the real estate team before this meeting, and they think about how to assess those, not all benefit. So costs might be other things, but at a minimum, it's foregone rent, and that's pretty quantifiable. So the benefits then may not all be quantifiable. It may not be a simple math equation.
Well, but some of the costs may not be quantifiable either.
I agree.
But
the easy one to start with is foregone rent, but there may be others. So in thinking about administering this and perhaps how it may come into a definition section in an AD, which has not been drafted, we're just thinking conceptually, Dana and Kirsten, is it helpful to have some examples, not necessarily to be put in the policy, but to help inform the AD development about benefits? I don't know. I'm teeing off our earlier conversation.
I think that would be helpful because we want to be able to bring something to the board that's meaty enough that they can actually assess without, maybe going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So understanding the real intent there, I think that would be helpful, Liz. I think that's a really good idea.
I had some ideas, but it's actually not that's irrelevant. It's really what the four of you intend.
So I'm wondering, just given the statement at the beginning of this, that the intent is to try and get it out of committee, if we're going to either circle back save time at the end to at least have a high level look at the direction, or we're going to deputize staff to try and capture what we had and just have that go to the board.
Or you schedule a brief meeting to look at just those changes before Thursday.
which might be tough. Julia, can I ask that we parking lot that question and get through the rest of them and see how much more there might be? Because if it's something, if it's going to end up being a lot, then we're going to have to do something differently than if it's just a few things.
Okay, I just want to put that at least in the parking lot.
Okay. Okay, so Liz and Mary and Dana and Kirsten and whoever else, did we give you enough to work with to kind of copy edit B?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. I think we Yeah, it's the definition of the PPS student that we kind of parking locked it, I think, that, I'm not sure
Yeah,
there was direction on that one. Okay,
yeah, we're not there yet.
yes, okay, sorry, my apologies.
Okay. So far we've just talked about the opening paragraph A and B. Okay.
Can we go back to the opening paragraph? Just because
Okay.
we skipped over that. I guess want to acknowledge that I think this is
Wait, hang on. Which opening paragraph are you talking
of the
about?
whole, I guess the whole policy. We just sort of jumped right into the list. Are we going back to that?
We're going to go back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. But I wanted to, I mean, I think this is the part that the staff had the questions about.
Mhm.
Wasn't it this?
Mhm.
Okay. So let's see if we can deal with that, and then we'll go back to the preamble. Okay, so C is the communities being served. So underserved students. Are we okay with that language?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so D, this is,
Wait a sec. I thought staff was asking for clarity about whether we mean PPS students or not.
that's D. That's the next bullet point.
Sorry, my bad.
Okay.
Carry on.
So that's what we're doing right now. So C, we're good with C. So we're moving on to D, which currently reads official connection of the other party to the district or its students. For example, PPS charter school, an organization providing direct services to PPS students. Close paren. Okay, so what do we mean by an official connection?
To me, I thought this was completely clear that is like enrolled in, they're in a school that has a charter from PPS. To me, I felt like this was pretty clear. I guess you could add it's enrolled students or a PPS charter school or an organization that provides direct services.
We're also dealing with nonprofits who might be providing after-school programs or something like that.
That would be, or an organization providing direct services to PPS students. So if to make it clear from my perspective, I would add the word enrolled before the word students, remove the paren and the EG, put a comma, put an or, and then another or before an organization providing direct services to PPS.
My one question about the enrolled, Julia, is if we're looking at like preschool for all and thinking about ways we might be partnering with people who will be future potential PPS students, if that might be a place of official connection.
I'm not sure, I'm not sufficiently familiar with the preschool for all format, but that might be a contract with PPS, right? So that would make an official connection.
I would say not necessarily so, that we might be a lease rather than a contract. So I wouldn't want to preclude that.
Okay, let me say something really starkly to just clarify my parameters. I do not believe that PPS should be subsidizing private schools that well, private schools. I think we have 50,000 students in PPS, and our prime directive is serving them and future students in a way that's going to be, it's going to provide the best educational opportunities. So Julia's example, Catlin Gable. Do I think we should be providing special terms to a Catlin Gable? My answer is no. Do we want to be able to work with organizations that may have significant, resource issues of their own, who would be serving PPS enrolled students? Yes, I think we do. And we also want to leave it open for, preschools, 3 and 4 year olds who can't be enrolled in PPS, but maybe in the future. So, I don't know. Does that clarify anything? I am personally interested in having some language that delineates who we want to be willing to work with in terms of lease terms, and who we really shouldn't be. Does that help in any way?
I think I echo those same sentiments about we want to be using, I always think about part of our job is to steward well the resources we have for PPS students. And so what does that look like and what does that mean is what we're trying to discern here, and to define that official connection as currently enrolled PPS students or young children who are future PPS students. That's a lot of language, but I would be comfortable with that kind of umbrella.
Okay, does that give enough guidance to come up with some language that we're all going to be able to live with and will be implementable? I'm looking
Dana?
for hands from, yes?
Sorry, yes, I think so. I from the staff perspective, I certainly understand the intent of the board. So I think that's.
Okay, so we might need to mess around with that language a little bit to.
Sure.
Okay. Are we good on that one?
Can I clarify? So what we were looking at, Julia had recommended adding enrolled before student. And then Julia, what was your other?
It was just taking the items out of like examples.
Examples. Okay.
And doing it or.
Thank you. That's it.
Students, because
Or maybe
of the preschool issue.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. E. The party on the other side of the transaction is a public entity that intends to actively use the property for public purposes. I had a thought today as I was reading this over again, just always dangerous. Can we add some language in there, something to the effect of, if that public entity later decides, yeah, no, we're not going to do what we said we were going to do, we're going to sell it off to a bar owner, that we have some way to claw back that property. You know what I mean? If we're selling it to a public entity or even leasing it to a public entity for a public purpose, if they're not going to use it for said public purpose, can we set up a criterion so that we get the property back?
Well, this section is just about leasing, so that would
Okay, leasing.
seem to be an automatic yes.
Okay. But even so, even if they're just leasing.
Well, either they're not using it but paying rent. And I would think at that point, if they didn't have any plans for it, they'd be glad to get out of that lease.
Okay, if this is just about the submarket rent in extraordinary times, why would a public entity need that?
Any more than we would.
Right.
I also don't think this section is entirely about leases. So
Oh,
I was just looking at that. It doesn't say it's just about leases.
my bad. Okay.
It says transaction involving district property.
Okay.
Anything.
So to me, like this could be, again, it's like the combination and the net is, I could see, like, say, for example, Prosper Portland or the city, I mean, coming in and saying like, hey, we'd like that property. This is when I think that the sort of, it's got to be more than just, hey, on balance, it's fine, but there has to be like some sort of strength of the net plus to the district to do something. Because just in and of itself, another public entity, I mean, the public entities do a lot of things. And, you know, Prosper Portland now is doing different things that they did in the past. But in the past, you know, I would say some of their actions didn't necessarily support PPS's
I mean, I think
community.
the bottom line, Julia, is that these are things that factors for the board to consider. But just because, I mean, it's not like Prosper Portland can come say, because you have this policy, you have to give us this property.
Right.
It's under still the judgment of the board to make these decisions, and these are, I think, factors that should go into decision making. Is this a public entity that's serving our community? Is this, and at some point we can tell a lot of anecdotal stories about what could be and what might be, and this could happen or that happened. But to really give other boards, I mean, I think what we're trying to do is give ourselves and other boards sort of some values around which to make decisions, that it's for the public good, that it's for the good of students, that it's for the good of underserved students. And that yeah, a lot of things might happen, but we cannot create a policy that would legislate against anything that we sitting here might disagree with. There has to be sort of some trust in future decision making as well.
Yeah, I totally understood, because the current policy actually already emphasizes that public entities should have sort of preferred status versus a private entity. So I'm just raising the issue that in and of itself, another public entity is, if I were ranking the criteria, it would be not necessarily the strongest one that I would consider.
So I would say we should make it clear that we're not going to sell anything below market rate based on a short-term economic or otherwise crisis. To me, a sale is a long-term, and I don't see any reason that we would sell a property to the city of Portland for below market rate because we're in a recession. I'm trying to imagine a scenario.
The recession would presumably dictate the market value. So, I mean, it would be market value if you sold it in a recession. It would be a crappy market value.
Yeah, I just don't see why we would even consider a transaction like that, period. So I wonder if we should clarify that these are lease issues and not sales issues that we're talking about in terms of below market, and then remove that clause entirely because we're talking about.
Okay, so
lease.
so there would be an easy fix. Let me just say what the easy fix would be, and then we can argue the merits. So at the beginning, on bottom of page 3, presumption of market rate terms or market terms, we could just specify that this is for leasing, for lease transactions, and then take out the possibility of doing this for a sale. Right? I mean, that's all we would have to do to change this at this point, right? So do we want to do that? I would be in favor of that.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know that I'm there. I'd have to think about it.
Okay, so let me just lay out the options here. So for E, if we're going to specify that this is only about leasing, then we can just delete E altogether. If we're going to continue to talk about it as possibly applying to sales, then I think I would like to have some language in there specifying that if we're going to cut a deal with somebody for an intended purpose and then they renege on the intended purpose, that we get to unwind the deal.
So we
As
can
in a right of first refusal, if they were selling it. I mean, if it,
Well, I mean, I tried to write some language and like, this is real estate, no, real estate. So I was throwing in, terms of art that I'm not sure I was using correctly. But anyway, basically, okay, I'm thinking Washington High School. We sold it to the city for a song with the understanding that they were going to use it for a public purpose. And then they didn't. And now it's a bar. It's a very nice bar. It's a very nice venue, but it ought to be a school. So I would like something in there that if we do cut a deal with a public entity to serve a public purpose, and then they don't serve the public purpose, we get to buy back the land at the original transaction. We just get to undo the original transaction. Because I don't want them holding onto it and then, making a windfall profit.
so I think I understand the objective. I'm thinking, Rita, through what it's like to do policy making with all of the nooks and crannies. So let me just throw out some thoughts. Is that for an indefinite period of time? Is that within the first 10 or 20 years? Is that, any sale will go through the board approval process anyway, but I'm thinking about how to write policy language over a long-term horizon with all, and every real estate lawyer will tell you that every transaction and every piece of property is unique, which is overstated, but it's part of the lore of the land. Unique attributes, unique situations. So again, it's not that it's not doable in terms of an intent. I mean, ultimately the decision on any sale, because almost every sale that you care about is over $150,000, which is the delegated threshold. So is the policy an instruction to negotiate that some sort of ability to buy back the land, whether the property, whether that's at the exact market price at the time it was sold, or market price plus 3% per year, or or if market value's gone down, then who gets the benefit of the increase or decrease?
Well, some of that can be in AD, right? You guys can.
It's still policy making in an AD for transactions that have lots of nuances, I guess.
Right,
so,
right. But I mean, I'm stating a value. I'm stating it perhaps not as eloquently or as comprehensively as I might like, but I mean, I'm saying this so that you know what my thinking is, and I don't know how to structure it in a way that's going to be legally enforceable.
Okay, why don't you let us see I think I understand the value, and I think you stated it very articulately. I'm just, and I don't need to I'll stop. I'm just trying to think through where what's a value statement and what's a mandate, and how does if a mandate, how does it play out in an individual real estate transaction that then that keeps living after close. So
Right.
let us think about that.
Okay. Okay. All right. So what about the rest of this section? Any comments about any of those changes?
I'm sorry, what section are you referring to now?
So it's just the tail end of the section we've been talking about, the presumption of market terms. So underneath the criteria.
So I just had a question. I don't know if it's in the very last paragraph. When we talk about approve and execute real estate transactions, I think before we introduced the topic of rent reductions, this mainly applied to sales. And that was what the transaction was describing versus like rent reductions. So I would expect that we would clarify that still applies to the sales or disposition of property or purchases, that it would be under the 150 versus rent reductions.
I'm sorry, Julia, I think I didn't understand. So 150 delegated threshold for purchases, but not that for rent reductions?
Right. I think that this was originally, when we originally discussed this, whatever, 3 years ago, this was about sales and purchases of property versus rent reductions.
So the purpose in having the board vote on individual lease transactions below 150,000 is distinguished from other delegated authority. What purpose are we trying, or does that fuel? Maybe that's what I'm.
Well, I guess I viewed this whole conversation of there is a determination by the board that we're going to treat people differently versus it's just a low dollar transaction.
I have no idea what kind of volume that gets you in terms of operationalizing that. I don't know if Dana or Kirsten.
I think where that would come into play is where we have agreements, for example, with Head Start, where we charge rent on the west side and we don't on the east side. So it's a decision to say, okay, we're not going to charge rent at all. Does that need to go to the board, or is that a staff decision? Same thing with childcare. So we have these lease agreements that are not always consistent. So does this include those? That was the city required easements and things like that we need to do for construction projects, and if they're under the 150,000, then the superintendent can delegate that authority. But if we're talking about removing rent or reducing rent, does that apply then to all of the agreements we have in the schools themselves for space?
So, okay, I'm still not quite sure what, I guess I didn't understand. So I'm reading this, and it looks to me like this paragraph carves out only transactions with essentially the easements, or a transaction that can be terminated within 90 days or less. Any right?
Or that's below the 150 is how I'm just trying to clarify, because when we had this discussion, a pretty lengthy discussion 3 years ago when we redid the policy, it was, hey, any sort of sale, for example, of a parcel of a property that was under 150, we were okay with that. Like, we were like, okay, that's okay, because that's under the delegation. And then we're going to get this quarterly reports about any of those leases signed below it. But I guess I'm confused by this, because to me, if we're setting up this criteria, why wouldn't it apply to anybody below market?
Julia, I get your point, but I think that language as written, it does only apply to the easement.
Okay, well, that's fine. If that's
or
that's
the
the interpretation.
Or the 90-day or less, because it says that first word in blue, in, that's not or. That says it's below the value and it involves either the easement or the 90-day or less.
So that's a drafting error. So
Okay.
that is not intended to blow through. Let's set aside rent abatement questions with extraordinary circumstances. That is not intended to reduce the approval threshold to only those matters that are below 150 and which involve conveyance. That was supposed to be additional transactions that did not require board approval. So I'm glad you caught it, because that is a draft that is not intended to further limit. It's actually an expansion of staff or superintendent, delegated to staff ability to execute transactions for rights of way or easements that are a condition. That was the staff request. So separate from the rent, below market rent terms. I want to make sure we're all aligned on that, and we'll fix that if, to the extent we are.
So would it make sense, since this paragraph is talking about a very specific circumstance, right? I mean, we're talking easements that we're going to have to do. We don't have a lot of say in the matter. It's just going to be what it is, right? Would it make sense to just, make this a separate section, put a header on it,
For easements?
just to clarify that it's, for these kinds of transactions, these are the rules? Does that make sense?
I think the header is delegated authority, right? I mean, it includes a number of transactions. This doesn't address Julia's concern, but I want to start with the universe that's larger. I do think, I think the interesting question, to Julia's point, as I'm thinking about how this works, is that the express, I don't think, Julia, you need, the way it's drafted now, to change the delegation limits, because it requires a board resolution under the terms of the policy. And whether that's intended or not, I don't know. But right now, even if the value of the lease was under 150, the express finding has to come from the board.
Okay, well, that answers it then.
Because it says, unless the board adopts a resolution that makes an express finding.
Okay, let's see.
Okay.
I guess just a final editing comment, as much as self-criticism as anything else. Clarifying that sale versus lease piece all the way through, I think, will help in clarity for those reading it.
So can I make sure, as I'm recalling and making sure I'm keeping up, or trying desperately to keep up, Rita talked about two alternatives for the presumption of market terms. one alternative was it just applies to leases and we delete paragraph E. The second is that it could apply to both, and we clarify that paragraph E, we draft language to have a right of reversion. I mean, all the things we're going to go figure out. Did we land on path number 2, or do we have a consensus on that, or are we still deciding?
So or path number 3, which is the A, B, C, D, however they are now. This below market only applies to leases, not to sales. And frankly, any sale to a public entity, if they end up not using it for a public purpose, that we would get some kind of right of first refusal under these conditions. We're not going to get gouged. Some kind of provision like that. We're not going to let you flip it back to us and you guys walk away with a humongous profit and we get stuck with the bill, kind of piece. Is that?
Yeah, no, I understand that the third option is a decent blend of the first two. So is there consensus among the committee members about 1, 2, or 3?
Okay, let's clarify what they are again.
Okay.
So
When
Liz,
we will consider a lease below market rate under these circumstances. That's one, and we've already gone through that. We will not sell below market rate, period. If we do sell a property to another agency, government entity, for their use for public purposes, and they end up not using it for public purposes, we get some kind of
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so I think we're talking about two options. One is this section about the market terms, is it going to apply only to leases or to leases and sales?
That was my point too, was to say only leases.
Okay, so we need to decide that. Are we talking only leases or do we want to include sales? I'm inclined to say just leases.
I can imagine a scenario in which we could have a below market sale to an entity that was, let's just say, preschool for all, a entity that's going to provide preschool in a building in which we, let's say, Applegate. And we decide that they're future students and we think that's of value to the district. We don't see in the long term that we're going to be using the property for a PPS, for a PPS service. And then again, somebody could say, well, the board could always like make an exception to their policy if something like that came up. But I guess I'm thinking that there could be some scenarios, just given we have a footprint that generally was to accommodate 70,000 students, and we have a lot less now.
I mean, I feel like so much of this conversation is about fears about what happened in the past happening again. And I think, I think we've made clear sort of this intention and thoughtfulness about our ultimate goal is for the policy to help us be very, very thoughtful about stewarding our resources well. And so I think, we obviously need to have some things about sales, because that's a place of past sort of concern. But I think, we're really focused on leases right now because that in some ways is more complex. So I feel like, to have, I think we need both to have some language around leases and some language around sales. It's just whether the language around sales goes here, is kind of my sense about this. But I also think like we can learn from what happened in the past, but we also can't legislate to prevent people making mistakes in the future, but we can do our best to sort of set some guidelines around our values. And I think that's the nitty gritty of what we're getting to rather than the very, very specific trying to prevent future mistakes. If that makes any sense at all.
Well, it does.
So what does that mean for what you think should be in the policy?
Well, I think, we focused on leases here, but we also do need to have something about, I think, a stance on our values around sales, right? That both of those are important. And that while we've talked about leases more expressly and specifically here in this section, as we've talked, I do think we need something about, even if it's just a line saying we do not, I think I would hate to say we do not sell under market value because I don't know what the circumstances might be in the future. And we can all come up with 1,000 stories, both pro and con there. But I do think we need to say, like, under pain of death, we don't sell for under market unless we have a really good reason that Liz approves. No, Liz just looked at me funny when I said pain of death. So that's why she got picked on there. But I do think we need to express the value that we're articulating, which is we do not sell properties for under market value somewhere in this policy.
I think the place to do that would be further up in that first section.
Yeah, so the previous section, the one right above it, is sale or long-term lease of real property. We could make a statement about the sale. So what we do say is,
So
we say that we should do long-term leases rather than sales. And
I'm thinking at the bottom of page 1.
well, yeah, that's, we went round and round on this sentence at a previous meeting, as I recall. Y'all know how I feel about things, so.
Yeah, we used to have language like a couple versions ago that said something like, I forget, it was like, and if it's a sale, like these things are super weighted or something. And I don't know what happened to that.
What? Didn't we have cold day in hell? Or
No, we did not. We did not. This language is actually stronger than it used to be.
the more stringently applied was, you can see it redlined on bottom of page 4, Julia.
Okay, sorry.
And if you've read Dante's Inferno, you know that there is a cold day in hell. So maybe not use that language.
I actually have read it, but it's been a while.
So, all right, where are we? We need to come to an actual
I believe
decision.
we're in hell.
Circle. So let's debate which circle of hell we're in right now. So no, we need to make a decision here. Do we want the section on market terms to apply to both sales and leases, or do we want to just limit it to leases?
So I would propose that it just apply to leases, and that we have language back at the bottom of page 1 that says only under extraordinary circumstances would we sell a property at below market rate. Similar to the,
Okay,
not
but
only
then,
would we,
but then the people who are having to make these decisions, they're going to have to decide what constitutes an extraordinary circumstance, right? Isn't that the next question? Dana?
well, that's
Back to us.
basically already in there for selling, period, of selling without a replacement.
Okay, so I'm
Correct?
fine with the language as it's written because I think the board has to make an express finding. We've laid out some criteria. I think we say this criteria applies and the board has to make a finding. And to me, that gives the, I guess, to Ailey's point, it provides some flexibility and doesn't say like this board is going to rule out, try and rule out everything, but it provides some flexibility to a future board. But it's like, and here's some guiding principles and criteria when you're making your express finding.
Well, Julia, the issue is that because we've moved that economic crisis into the main paragraph, that means that we wouldn't make that sale of, say, Applegate to a provider unless there was a major recession or something along those lines, as opposed to, for whatever reason, we might want to do that under, again, extraordinary circumstances for a good reason, makes sense for them to take over maintenance instead of us.
But Scott, the language under A is extraordinary economic or other unusual circumstances, which is broader, right? So which would allow for, say, a significant reduction of students, or your suggestion that we want somebody else to take the maintenance over. So it's a little broader language.
Unusual is unusual. I think it's a difference between a short term and a long term, in my mind.
Okay, you're fading in and out, Scott.
I think yeah.
Okay, so the longer we talk about, I don't know about anybody else, but the longer we talk about it, the more confused I'm getting. So how about we do this? Liz, how about you try to figure out what it is that we're saying here and get back to us?
Good luck.
I'm happy to do that. Trying to remember I know Rita, you're one of the assigned board members to this policy. In absence of another public meeting, I think Scott, are you the other one?
I don't think so.
Or Julia. Anyway.
I'm happy to help.
No, we have a list. I just can't remember. I'm sorry.
No, it's Ailey. It's me and Ailey.
Is it Ailey? Well, there you go. Is the direction to work with the two of you in the absence of a public meeting, and then it goes to the meeting on the 12th, and there can be discussion there if that language doesn't work for Scott or Julia, or is it to have another meeting beforehand? I mean, absent a public meeting, we can't all
right. So
convene.
So I guess, so we're talking about quite a few changes that are fairly complicated.
Mm-hmm. Or we bring it back to the next meeting in 3 weeks. I mean, that's the other.
Okay, I don't like saying this, but I think it's the prudent thing to do. Let's kick it back to the next policy committee meeting and commit to ourselves that at the end of that meeting, we are going to have a policy to forward to the rest of the board.
So Rita, one thing that might make that real would be in the interim to be, because I'm in some ways, like, I'm fine with the delegation on wordsmithing if there's an understanding of what it is that we collectively want to have done. Like, I don't need to be involved in that, but I'm not sure that we're in agreement on the policy thing. So maybe it's after this meeting, staff, like, here, here's just the wordsmithing bucket. And then here are the two places where it's not, it's a value or a directional, and there's two different approaches that we're not sure which it is. And then just to send that out with, like, where are people? And then if we have a majority on, say, the one outstanding issues, like this applies to sale and leases, for example, and there's a majority, then you can just draft the language. But I'm hesitant to, like, we get to a meeting in 3 weeks and we're still not clear on where people were on.
Well, how about that? Can we split the difference on this? I'm a little concerned about us essentially taking a vote over email. I'm channeling Liz here. So how about we do this? I think there's really only one issue where we're still at loggerheads. Like, we've still got an option A and an option B, and we haven't decided. I think the others we've sort of massaged, and we need to, we're going to have to work on wordsmithing. But I think, I mean, am I wrong? But I think the only thing that we're still undecided on is sale versus sale, or do we include sale as well as lease in the market terms section? Okay, so here's my proposition. Ailey and I will work with staff. Staff will work with staff, and then you'll come back to Ailey and me with some thoughts, and then we will work up two options. One that includes sales and one that doesn't, and bring it to the next policy committee, and then we'll make a decision. Okay? Okay. All right. Because we're running behind now. Well, we're not quite behind, but we're about to be behind, because we need to go back to the preamble. So Julia, you had some, and we haven't talked about this at all. There's a lot of new words here. Julia, you had some thoughts to begin with.
Yeah, well, so this is going to be super brief, because mainly why I wanted to come back to this, I just wanted to say that I thought this was really well done, and I think it's a much better introduction to this section than we had before. So it's mainly just to thank staff and the community members who worked on this. So thank you, Danny, and I think you were the lead on this. So that's all I wanted to add. I don't have any wordsmithing. I just think it's a way better way for us to approach our assets.
Okay. Any other comments?
On the policy generally, or this section?
I just echo what Julia said. This is an awesome preamble. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, team. This is really great.
Okay. And I third that. Okay, so any other comments about the preamble? Because that's where the bulk of the new stuff is, beyond what we've already done. Okay, anything that we need to talk about before we move on?
Just two small things. On page 2, under sale or long-term lease of the property, the third sentence down, it says the district property does not support, and I would just add, and is not expected to support the district's mission, just so we're not just looking at the current status quo. And then the last thing is, I think we had an agreement on what that last paragraph meant, and so I just wanted to, and I don't have to do this here at this meeting, but just get confirmation from Liz that that is what, that the express there's still an express finding Okay.
I can confirm that for you.
Okay, that's it. Then I have. But
Okay.
again, really well done, I think, from the staff's perspective on the preamble and setting this policy up.
Okay. All right. We are pretty much on time, I think, aren't we? Actually, we're ahead of schedule.
No, we're behind by about 45 minutes. Yeah.
Right. We're way behind. Okay, I'm looking at the wrong number. Okay. All right. So it's been an hour and a half. I'm going to try to abide by our agreement. Let's take a 5-minute break and get back at 5:40. Okay, it's a 4-minute break. 5:40. Okay. Forward it on to the full board if we can. I think we might be able. I think that's a reasonable thing to ask because for the professional conduct policy, the changes that we're talking about today are technical changes, and I think only 2. For the anti-racist learning communities policy, we have looked at it before. I don't think it's changed significantly, really significantly. Well, it has a bit, but anyway, I'm hoping that we can make progress today. So let's leap right in. And who's gonna, Danny, are you gonna take the lead on this one?
Yeah, with lots of support and care from Mary Kane, who's been amazing as per usual. So I think as Moore stated, you all have seen this before. There are a couple changes, and I think one of the things that we just wanted to point out is that we made a decision to take out some language around the more specifics around restorative justice and the impacts of those practices on for consequences. Right now, there's quite a few different policies and administrative directives being developed around sort of the integration of this. I think what we proposed instead was to highlight that there are consequences. Those consequences are in alignment with our approach, and to kind of leave it there. I think if you'll recall at the last board meeting, there was lots of questions and sort of reactions to the implications of sort of like the use of restorative practices. And I think there's just still some more work to be done around understanding what that is. And so rather than hold this policy to the standard of everyone sort of coming to that place of understanding around what restorative practices is, when this is one portion of it, we thought that we would take that out and then sort of move forward without that confusion. Still a lot of work to be done, and we intend to do that, but we wanted to just kind of make it a little bit easier. And given the sort of state's deadlines, we wanted to see if maybe it might be easier to move forward in this way. We also, so I would say that of all the changes, the major one that we just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of and had an understanding of the reasoning behind that.
Okay. Okay, so any comments? I mean, any overall comments? Let's do overall. But if people have specific things that they have questions or comments about.
I really liked the anti-oppression inclusion of that language. And then I thought, like the thing about teaching history is still really important, that learning about use of symbols in the past so that informs the present. I also really appreciated that addition. So I think it's I'm very happy with the policy. Thank you for your work.
So I'm confused. I thought the history piece came out.
So at the bottom of...
Did it just get moved?
Yeah, so in the first paragraph in paragraph 3, section 3.
So it's worded very well, Julia, where it's about, still observing the anti-racist and anti-oppression goals of the policy, but that they fit in with the Oregon state standards.
Okay, so that is that, and I'm not objecting anything, I'm just trying to understand. So in number 2, we eliminated, it's important for students and staff to understand the historical context. And that is now, just so I understand, morphed into the number 3, expectations and consequences, the first paragraph.
Yes.
Okay. So,
Oh, go ahead. Did you have more, Julia?
yeah, I just had one. I just had one other thing, and so there was. I understand the administrative directive is in process, and that I think will be helpful, just as a general guidance to the broader school community, not necessarily for the development of this policy. So my only thing that I think is, to me, is missing, and this is more of it's not that I don't think it meets the general guidelines of the statutory requirements, but number 3, second paragraph, the last line, where we, in addition, the district will incorporate learning opportunities to support the goals of this policy, is, I think so much of this is not going to be about compliance, but really the district basically supporting our students and our community and the families in better understanding hate speech and symbols and what they are, because what I've seen over the last couple of years, and we've had our share of incidences, clearly there's many with like bad intent, but there is often like it's lack of awareness or unintentionality, but actually having really significant impacts. And so I hate to lose that sentence in which we're expressing that this is really going to be a learning process for many in the district about what those are. Again, at the very high level, I think everybody knows like the noose, the Confederate flag, those things. But if you look at the list of symbols that we call out here, the hate on display symbols, it's, I think, more complex, and there's a lot to be learned by the school community. So anyway, I would like to leave that sentence in of something that part of the goal is not, this isn't just a, hey, the state told us we had to do it and it's a compliance thing, but really we want our students and our families to understand the impact some of these things have that most people may not have an awareness about.
I agree, Julia, and I think it goes beyond the symbols. The idea of an anti-racist, anti-oppression learning community is something that our graduate portrait supports. So I think that it is already sort of infused in the DNA. So if we can add a sentence saying, part of our learning goals does include, things that support this policy, the goals of this policy, because just teaching someone, okay, this symbol is bad, is one thing. It's that deeper learning about how oppression and racism shows up in systems as well as in behaviors around symbols.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. Kara, Mary got kicked out. Can you please let her back in the room? Sorry.
Yeah.
She's supposed to be playing a support role. And all of a sudden I was like, where'd Mary go?
Making dinner.
To chime in on that.
I'm back. I'm best supportive when I'm silent, apparently.
Just to chime in on restoring that sentence, just as an example, the school name changes could come under that category, and it's not part of the curriculum, but it is certainly a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. I think adding this, we can sort of work on adding the sentence. I think you'll see, and I think you got a little bit of a sort of things to come in the work around the AD for the AD work around renaming, where we're going to have a toolkit that kind of gives a little bit of this. And in the election toolkit, we also had really kind of explicit ways to kind of sort of what do you do when you see this, or what type of behavior is this? And so our intent is to not only address the ignorance that may come from not knowing what the symbols are, but also to address what we're seeing, which is more likely is that the grooming that takes place, and sort of how the symbols are used as a way to sort of like groom folks into that. And so I think that what we want to have in the administrative directive is why it's taking us a little bit longer. It's just a really robust, sort of like as much recent information that we have to incorporate opportunities to learn, and also to codify some of the protocols that we've had around the responses, and then a link to the administrative directives around student conduct and discipline, and the approach around restorative practices. So I think it's just still, just trying to connect those dots and make sure that we have all of the accompanying things there. So I know that Director Berman, you had some questions and some suggestions, and so we'll make sure that we're, I think the spirit of learning is exactly what we're trying to do. I think that the, condemning these is one thing, but more than anything, we have to try to learn and try to do differently. And so that's what the spirit of the AD will look like, and certainly the support that we'll try to give to administrators and educators.
And Danny, if you can you talk for just a second about the Western States teaching tolerance book, which we want to borrow heavily from
Totally.
as part of the toolkit.
Yeah. So both Western State Center had a toolkit, as well as teaching tolerance, and teaching tolerance was more geared towards administrators. Western State Center, kind of linked to all of the different symbols, but then they had kind of, and we adapted it in the election toolkit. Basically, sort of like if someone says, well, it's my right to have a picture of a noose on my T-shirt. You're impeding my free speech. We gave sort of like practical responses that said, and we used a lot of Western State Center's sort of prompts, and then we added the link to the vision, the sort of like educator essentials or the graduate profile, and sort of just kind of gave folks those practical ways to kind of push back on some of the things that'll come up, because I think we can say you can't do this. There's going to be pushback, or there's going to be incidents where people use this, and so we want to make sure that we're giving folks tools to respond in a way that's in alignment.
And I think that's where when we were looking at some of the language around restorative justice approach versus discipline, that we had a lot of conversations with some of the students who were engaged in some of our subcommittee meetings, and it is very difficult, and I think it's what Danny mentioned earlier, why we want to remove it from the policy and embed it more in the administrative directive and really in the toolkit, because these incidents are so individualized, and Julia, to your point at a previous meeting of what symbols mean is a constantly evolving thing, and oftentimes students don't exactly know what it is, and so that becomes, is that the discipline moment or is that the teachable moment? And looking at trying to assess when we can approach something and try to change hearts and minds, I don't know, but at least make people aware of what it is, as opposed to doing kind of a prescriptive disciplinary action. And there are going to be times when discipline is absolutely going to be warranted, but it's a very individualized decision, right? Depending on so many circumstances, the maturity of the child, the impact on the other students, etc.
Okay, so any other issues or comments with the language?
Yeah, just want to say again, thank you. I'm really happy with the changes and with the comments that have been made so far. The only other like awkward word is trespass, which is at the end of a paragraph. And I don't know if you mean charged with trespass or,
We
but
trespass visitors or contractors. That's our,
I'm with Scott. We are simpatico on this. Mary will talk about it. We misuse it all the time and we need to use it correctly. So,
wow, is that a verb?
it-
I'm going to trespass you.
and
In
what
my
you really
mind-
mean is no trespass you, right? So it actually isn't even, it's not a verb and it's used incorrectly, but
Right.
we'll
right.
fix it in the policy. I'm
But aside from
with you.
that, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Awesome.
Um,
Thank you.
Okay. I had a couple of copy edits. One I think is quite minor. The other one I think is minor, but I want to bring it up because it might be more than minor. This is on page 2 at the top in B. Is reasonably likely to interfere with the rights of students. It currently reads, by denying them full access to the services, blah, blah. That strikes me as a pretty high bar. So my suggestion is to delete by denying them. So it would read, is reasonably likely to interfere with the rights of students to full access to services, activities, and opportunities. Does that make sense? Is that an operationalizable thing?
yes. Yes.
Okay, because I think it's hard to, I think it would be hard to make a case in a lot of these circumstances that a kid has been actually denied access. But we can make a case that their right has been interfered with. So anyway. Oh, you guys okay with that one? Does that make sense?
Could you go over, that still strikes me as, what exactly does that mean? To me, the direct impact on a student is to feel incredibly devalued, attacked, and not around access to a service.
So, for example, if there's like a club and all the club members are wearing a shirt with a Nazi symbol on them, you're not going to feel like you have access to that club. If you're, if you're Jewish or if you're,
Do we want to add any nod in the direction towards social emotional well-being?
So I just want to point out that that language comes directly from the ODE rule, which doesn't mean that we can't change it if we're not changing the meaning, but just as a reference point, and we could assess that.
I mean, I wouldn't want to join that club. And it's having a material impact on me as a person, maybe not on school activities, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
So I can think of that something might not impact A or B, but would certainly violate what we're talking about here.
I think that if there was a club of kids who all wore Nazi t-shirts at my school, it would create a feeling of unsafety in the school, right? So I do think it has an impact on school activities. I think we read that really broadly of, if a student feels unsafe in their own community because there's a loud, vocal, and visible group, I think that's clear. I think it's the more insidious, the smaller grooming incidents that Danny was talking about that are harder to maybe pinpoint, but that are part of this disruption and infringement on student rights.
Yeah, I don't know if you've had an opportunity, and like Liz said, the language came from ODE and from the state board, and I think what they're trying to do here is to sort of like is to make this case. And the chair of the board, Kimberly Howard, spoke about her experience going to school and sort of like being called the N-word, and sort of like how that created not just a to your point, Rita, not just a feeling of unsafe, but was experienced as a hard barrier to belonging there. And so I think that I think what they're trying to establish is that these symbols, this language creates such a barrier to access that it is in fact rises to the occasion of sort of denying the sort of like when it comes into competition with like your right to free speech, that it's I'm so sorry, I'm not saying the legal thing. I think I'm getting shy because I'm looking at Liz, but it basically sort of like rises to the level where it's a consideration that's not protected by free speech.
Right. I think that's the legal term, is to denial of access. If there's that, when you create that hostile school environment, you have denied access.
So I think they're trying to make your point, Scott and Rita, of that like that the symbols actually reach that bar, and that they are still holding a high standard, and the use of these symbols meets that standard.
Okay, so I guess the question is it more prudent to maintain the language that we have inherited from the state school board? Or is there any value in PPS making it more clear in real people language what we mean? That,
I mean,
it doesn't mean that you're barring the entrance to something. It means you're making people feel uncomfortable, and therefore.
Right.
I might suggest maybe adding a bullet point that sort of speaks to that the sort of like the third thing, but I guess I wouldn't want to dilute A or B inadvertently. Does that make sense? Because I think I think is my understanding, and sort of watching the videos and sort of hearing is that they were sort of like building this case. So maybe adding one that sort of speaks to or create, sort of or contributes to, lack of a sense of belonging, etc.
And I think I don't like
hostile school environment.
What is it?
Yeah, it's a hostile school environment. I don't like the word uncomfortable because that can be dismissed. I mean, I think this is making a hostile school environment. That's 100%. And yes, people are uncomfortable, but I think we dismiss people's discomfort all the time and say, oh, just get a sense of humor, or grow up. They didn't mean it that way. But I think when we make this case that this is infringing on people's rights to be at school, to be safe, to be in a community that is whole, I think that's the statement the school board, the state board was trying to make.
So we could add a C that says is reasonably likely to create to the creation of a hostile educational environment for students.
I would support that.
I'd put that as B. And if there's any way to keep the language of C, but to elaborate on it, because as it reads, it feels very abstract. It doesn't get the point across. I agree. I see it's a really important point that it infringes on the students' sort of full personhood in that school and participating in that school, apart from feeling hostility directed at them. And if there's any way to keep that language, but to elaborate on it, to make it a little more personal, or to connect with people more.
Okay.
And if not, there are more important things, but to me, it does not have the impact that I think the people who wrote it wanted to have. again, for a regular person reading it, it's going to be a bit of a head scratcher unless there's more elaboration. And
We can expand that language.
yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna, unless somebody objects, I'm gonna stop us here because we're way over time and I want to make sure we have time to talk about the climate. Can we ask staff to just make a few changes, what we talked about, and then if you can come back to us, if you could get it back to us before the packet goes out on Thursday?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should move this forward because we're so close.
Yeah, yeah. But it just, it would be nice if we could get it sometime on Wednesday, say, I mean, we're talking about a sentence or two, right? So if we could get it on Wednesday, and then if anybody wants to do a, oh, hell no, I can't live with that sentence, let us know. Otherwise, it will go forward.
Okay.
Okay.
So just a clarification, back to the original issue that I said something about and Ailey did as well. Just adding some sentence about the learning piece of it. Knowing that election toolkit was a great resource, but that will be outside the policy, but just have something like one sentence that frames that up.
Well, we can put that back. We can put that sentence back.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we good? Okay, let's move on to professional conduct policy. And I'm going to ask that we try to get through this really fast because it's really technical and it's real short. So Mary, you going to take that one?
Yes.
Okay.
So there are two minor changes to this for purposes of our current practice. And you can see them highlighted there. The first one is as a result of us working very hard to try to capture the requirement that all contractors be required to do mandatory training. The number of contracts that we have, the kinds of contractors that we have that have no access to students at all, make it prohibitive both in terms of our capacity to oversee it as well as the cost involved in doing it. And so we're asking for a minor change to it, that it's contractors who have direct unsupervised contact with students be required to do the professional conduct training. We have, just to ease your mind about this, the team that I have been working with over the last, I think 2 years on developing contract training standards, we have developed some pretty robust trainings for contractors who have direct unsupervised contact with students. Danny can speak to this because most of them are in her portfolio. They are required to do everything that a PPS employee is required to do. This is for those contractors who don't have that level of engagement, who may be in another state doing IT work for us, and so that's what we're asking for. The second amendment is in response to the changes that we have made because of COVID. And it's specific to the Remind app that we now use, which allows us to text students directly. We had not wanted that of pre-Remind. We had not wanted teachers to engage with students in texting with but because Remind allows us to have oversight of these communications, and because it's been so useful to us during this CDL, we're asking that you make this minor edit, which is that this be allowed on district approved platforms, of which Remind, currently it's Remind, it may be something else in the future. So those are the two edits.
Okay. Any questions about those edits?
So I have just a clarifying question that was raised, and it relates to the last point, and maybe this is just like for the record. It's a last point raised by Mary about the platforms. Students don't always use their PPS accounts, but for an adult communicating with a student, as long as the staff uses their account, that they're okay, because that is captured then by the system. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
And for now, I didn't name the platform because my guess is that we will find something newer and better in the next year or two. But for now, it's Remind, and I've been told by staff it's been remarkably helpful for students to keep their students engaged.
Okay. Are we good with these two edits? Any objections? Okay.
Sorry, on the copy I have, I didn't see a second edit.
It had been in previous iterations on the board webpage. When we posted it this last time, it fell off, so it was replaced again today. But it's been on there, as I said, in the previous iterations that were on the page from the last board meeting.
Was that revised copy not circulated to committee members, Mary? And if not, can that happen right now so at least Scott has a copy to look at?
Roseanne has to give me that answer. I don't know the answer to that.
Board book.
It's in board books? Okay.
Replaced like today, because
Yes.
We just noticed that it had been dropped.
Okay, no worries. I'll check on that. And
if you look at your previous
probably
one,
totally fine with it, so no worries.
Okay.
It's one sentence and it's like pink or red lettering.
I think page 5.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that, Scott, you're okay with the change.
Yeah.
And you'll let us know if that's not the case. But can we take a vote on forwarding these changes onto the full board? All in favor, say yes.
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 Okay. That was 3, I think. So no objections, no abstentions. So we'll forward those changes onto the full board.
I said yes. There should be 4 yeses, right? Did you vote too, Rita?
Oh, yes. 4. Okay. Unanimous forwarding on it. Okay. I'm a selfless person, so my vote. Okay. So the other thing I want to say before we leave this altogether, there are additional changes that are going to be coming to us in future. And there may be probably 2 sets of changes that will be coming, and we'll be getting 1 set relatively soon, I think within the next couple of months.
This is the first set.
This is the first.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah,
second
so
set will come relatively shortly.
Yes.
Okay. So we're not done with this policy altogether, but there's a fair amount of urgency around these particular changes. So we're pushing this through now, but don't be surprised in a couple of months when we go back. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the climate. I want to give a little intro here. Because I want to sing the praises of Dr. Tanya McKee. Let me just give a little background. You know her now as a Senior Director of Humanities since 2019. Prior to that, she was an assistant professor at PSU. She has her dissertation from Auburn University in 2016. And her dissertation was on the U.S. Department of Education Green Ribbon Schools Award. And I want to talk about this a little bit because she's got some serious street cred on the issue of sustainability and environmental policy making for schools and school districts. I had never heard of the Green Ribbon Schools, so let me just read the blurb from the U.S. Department of Education site. The aim of this program is to inspire schools, districts, and institutions of higher education to strive for 21st century excellence by highlighting promising school sustainability practices and resources that all can employ. To that end, the award recognizes schools, districts, and higher education institutions that 1, reduce environmental impact and costs, 2, improve the health and wellness of schools, students, and staff, and 3, provide effective environmental and sustainability education. Combined progress in all 3 of these areas, known as pillars, serves as a basis for recognition. So Dr. McKee wrote an entire dissertation on that. So in addition to that, since her degree, she is a current member of the United States Green Building Council. She was part of the Sustainability Leaders Network for Green Schools. She is a peer reviewer of the journal Green Schools Catalyst Quarterly since 2016. And she's a peer reviewer of proposals for the Green Schools National Conference since 2017. So not only does she know what she's talking about, she's certified as knowing what she's talking about. So we are enormously lucky to have her with us as we contemplate this policy. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. McKee. Take it away.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see a big smile from the superintendent, as he's done lots of work around sustainability previous to coming to Portland Public Schools. I even picked up the San Francisco policy in my presentation tonight, just for you, to remind you of all the great work you did. Let's see here. I suppose I need to share my screen. So let me. Let's see here. Of course, I haven't shared on Zoom before. Rita, I'm impressed that you did part of my presentation for me.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I think that's
wonderful. I didn't want to put you in the awkward position of telling us how smart you are. So,
Kara, can you put up the presentation for some reason? Maybe I don't have access to share my screen. Oh wait,
it says have access.
It says only host.
I made you a co-host.
Okay.
Let's see. You want to try it now? Do you see the option? Otherwise, I can.
Let me just see here. It's being a little funny. Let's see. Yeah,
okay.
The screen comes up, but it keeps saying only the host, so I'm not really sure.
Okay, just 1 second.
All right. So if you feel a little awkward, I'll just have you click through it, so you can just go ahead and go to the next slide. So I was asked to share a little bit about the national landscape around climate justice and sustainability pertains really to the policies that have been put into place by districts across the United States. And so as Rita mentioned, I received my PhD at Auburn University And prior to attending Auburn University, I was really interested in ecological principles or green school practices as a principal. And really where that came from is this idea of, on this first slide, is where we learn matters. And that school facilities do have a direct impact. And I'm going to kind of set up, I'll go through a few slides for you to read, but it's important to understand why a policy needs to be in place, but more so, you know, what does that policy look like, the implementation of that policy, in terms of what needs to be in place for this, for things to actually change. And so I start with, so you just see on the slide, right, student and staff health. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and Rita alluded to it when she pulled up the pillars of the green ribbon, because we're going to talk about the 3 pillars of the green ribbon as one of the frameworks for schools. Of course, academic achievement, environmental resources, and property values. Go ahead, Kara. So I have a few slides, and I'm going to just give you time to read them yourself. And I just kind of want you, as you go through the slides, just to read at least the bolded, but just kind of keep in mind that whole idea of why school facilities matter. Okay, Kara, you can go ahead and just go through the next one.
So can I just ask a question? So as I was looking at the slides in advance of the meeting, I was wondering if we have, like, this is a national, most of these slides relate to sort of a national context, and I know that we've done a lot of work, some places a lot more work than other places have happened nationally, and other places maybe we're just like the national average. So I was wondering, do we have the click down for PPS, given that's our context?
So I don't personally have the context of PPS. Aaron or someone in facilities may be to talk about some of the things that PPS has already done. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the other pieces. I know you said you went through the slides, because that is a really good point. And I made that comment a couple weeks ago, that there are some things that are already happening that could be highlighted and should be highlighted around the work that's happening already in some schools as well as a district. Kara, go ahead and go to the next one. We'll just go through a few more just so you can just try to set the context. Okay, next one. All right, the next slide.
Tanya, I did have a question about the slide about garbage and throwing away. Is that per day, per week, per month, per year? I'm assuming not per year.
No, that one, waste is, I would say a pound is per week. That's an average. So these slides in particular come from the U.S. Green Building Schools, the Center for Green Schools, and part of it is to set the stage for school boards to talk about all of the different reasons as to why you put a policy in place, and more so how you move from a policy to implementation. Kara, next slide. And the next one. All right, and the next one. So I start with those slides, and so part of the work of being part of the Sustainability Leaders Network is sustainability leaders and directors across the United States to have conversations. Districts, they're either a district person, they might be somebody from a school, they're from universities, and really looking at sharing different things that are happening in districts around sustainability. And so the Center for Green Schools actually supports schools and districts all across the United States. So setting it up there, and I shared this with Liz and others, that there are some frameworks around sustainability. And one of those frameworks is the U.S. Department of Education's Green Ribbon Award. And I'll really briefly go over those 3 pillars as I'll just show a slide as Rita mentioned that. And then the whole school sustainability framework from Barr, Cross and Dunbar out of UC Boulder. And then the ecological democracy, whole school sustainability. And I share that because when you're looking at some of the examples of the policies from across the US, they reflect these frameworks. And there's some specific pieces that are really important to include in a policy and the implementation plan to make sure that it's actually sustainable. So, for example, the last slide that talked about green jobs, students, education, being environmentally literate is really important part of a policy to ensure that it's sustainable, that it actually happens. So I'm just going to quickly show you a couple slides on each of the frameworks, and then I'm going to go through and highlight a few of the policies. A couple of them are from the Council of Great City Schools, but just to see some of the work that others have done. You can go ahead and click, Kara. So just really quickly, Rita mentioned this, is that there's 3 pillars of the U.S. Department of Green Ribbon Schools, and it's about net impact, or the reduction of resources, waste, water, energy, CO2. And so Julia brought up a really good point, is that there are some of those pieces that PPS is already doing in the facilities department to decrease or have a net impact. And then the second pillar is about health and performance, health and wellness, school gardens. So, we have gardens at certain schools. There is a learning garden at Portland State University. Dr. Dillafruz Williams oversees the learning gardens. But health and performance is also about food, what students are eating, getting outside, recess, physical education, the safety of our buildings, right? The ventilation, the CO2, stuff like that in terms of health and wellness, and then environmental literacy. And so the environmental literacy, again, schools offering, environmental science courses, classes on sustainability, having conferences around green jobs, but that idea that it's not just one thing by itself with the framework, that it does include all 3 of the different pillars. And so, like Rita said, schools that show growth, they can apply for award. Oregon used to participate in the past, but does not participate for the award anymore. But this graphic, just in general, just showing that this idea that if we're going to, reduce this, but we can also increase the health and performance, environmental literacy. But the other piece that the 3 pillars really focuses on is students, the leadership of students. How do students lead this work in their schools and their districts, which is incredibly important, as you'll see some of the other policies. Next slide. And so there's just talks about the reducing and the improving. I just said that. So next slide. So just to give you a sense of how many schools, and I show this, so my dissertation focused on the first 3 years, the 190 schools. And so I dug in deep to all 190 school applications. I interviewed teachers at some of the schools, and I really looked at what were the practices that were implemented and sustained, really interested more so in terms of schools win awards all the time, but seeing that something was sustained, and why was it sustained? And I show this because when you see that there's 595 schools, districts, and post-secondary have won this award since 2012. So there's lots of examples out there of what schools and districts and post-secondary are doing around these 3 pillars that's focused on students. But one of the really big pieces that came out of my research around their green schools wasn't just the ecological principles, but it was the democratic principles that had to be present in the schools or the school districts so that the sustainability continued. And so what I mean by that is that there had to be leaders in the building. I'm going to show that with a couple of the other frameworks. And actually, I met with the Center for Green Schools when I was doing my research and asked them why there wasn't a 4th pillar around organizational leadership or democratic principles or something around the importance of leadership, transparency, choice, accountability. And actually what they said is that they had that on the docket when they were initially rolling out the award, but they weren't sure if it would be too much to ask schools to have the 4th pillar, so they didn't move forward with it, which is really fascinating because as you move into the other 2 frameworks, a piece of the next 2 frameworks focus on students. It focuses on student leadership. It focuses on champions in schools. And it's this idea that when you're putting something in place, right, you want to have buy-in. So I'll just tie this into the literacy work, right? If I come out and say, I'm going to mandate this because this is the best thing there, I'm going to get pushback, right? But if I say, I want to give you an opportunity. I want you to come along with this journey. I'm going to guide you as we go. We're going to learn together. And we started small, like in terms of the science of reading training, and we began to build the momentum. We started as a pilot, and I would say we've moved to a movement. But if I would have started with a mandate of this is what you have to do, I can tell you that I wouldn't be successful. And so I share that piece, and you can go to the next slide, Kara, is that these next 2 frameworks really focus on, so you look at this one, this is Whole School Sustainability Framework out of UC Boulder. And again, sustainability in the middle, but there's a physical place, right? Things that happen in the physical building. Then there's an educational program, and you'll see the word charismatic champions. Barr actually did a whole, Jennifer Barr, in her master's thesis around this, around things that happened in schools happened around a charismatic champion. And unless that was brought in and sustained in some kind of organizational change, when that person left that building, that initiative went along with it. You'll see student powered is one of the pieces. Where are the students in this, right? Leading the green teams, possibly leading work around the curriculum, and then organizational culture, communication, vision, and mission. And when I look at this framework in particular, I see pieces that are already here in PPS, right? The vision and mission. We're focused on a vision and mission. We're looking at engaging in active designs of facilities, new buildings going up. When you think about educational program, as we're doing some work around writing curriculum, not just in the climate justice work, but also within social sciences and language arts, we're also, looking at engaging students and getting student voice in the materials that we're choosing. So there are some things here that we're seeing outside of just a climate justice or a sustainability. Next slide. And you can go ahead and go to the next one. And so this is the third framework, and a big part of the second part of my dissertation really focused on ecological and democratic principles. That I actually created a survey and I interviewed teachers around their perceptions of ecological and democratic principles in their green ribbon school or school district, and was looking to see that were both democratic principles evident as well as ecological principles. So this framework, pertains to the idea that if you have a high level of ecological principles and you want to get to a high level of democratic principles. And in some of the findings in my work was that in the first year of the Green Ribbon schools, there wasn't a lot of democratic principles evident in that first round of schools. But as 2013, 2014, and so on, more and more schools reported on democratic principles that were evident in their schools. And also, part of the findings were that sustaining ecological change required evidence of democratic leadership in community. So when I was asked to share a little bit, I pulled the 3 frameworks that are out there. And the reason for that, and even starting with the few of the slides to start with, is that when I show some of the examples from the school districts that have created policies, that these pieces are there. The students are evident, are present in their policy, and that there's leadership. Because I always use this example that you cannot make a teacher, an employee, or a student recycle anything. You can't make them do that. But you can engage them in the conversation as to why we should, and why they could help lead the work, and what it does in terms of benefits. And so really talking about, as a policy puts into place, what are the benefits, right? Why are we reducing waste? Why are we recycling? Why are we, building new facilities? What pieces, when you're looking at the new facilities, for example, what was put into place in terms of health and wellness for the students? And then that education piece. And that piece is so crucial to the work, is how do we ensure that environmental or sustainability literacy is evident? So next slide, Kara. And just real quickly, if you're curious, these are the 6 ecological principles. They actually initially come from the work of Capra, and then Kensler borrowed from them. And then next slide. And then the 10 democratic principles. So as I'm talking about democratic principles, fairness and dignity, purpose and vision. Again, purpose and vision was part of the whole school sustainability framework. Integrity, reflection, evaluation, accountability, transparency, choice, and so forth. And so again, sharing that in a policy moving forward that's evident in the national landscape of policies, that many of these democratic principles show up in the policy or in the implementation plan of the policy, so that when a policy goes into place, that there's an implementation that this is going to happen. Next slide. So there's lots of examples of policies. I included the ones here, and I'll talk a little bit about them, but they're were all uploaded in a Google folder. I actually added a few more since then. And then there's also a folder of additional articles and resources, more so talking about the frameworks. But just to give you, depending on what you were interested in, there would be something for you to read if you were interested. So Baltimore Public Schools, Howard County's also in Maryland, Seattle, Austin, San Francisco, San Diego. And again, part of the work is I reached out to several of my colleagues in the Sustainability Leaders Network over the break. Unfortunately, it seems that they were also taking a break. I guess I was the only one unworking. And so this morning I heard from many more school districts because I couldn't find all of their policies. But working with many of them, because the question I had for them, was hoping I would get some answers before tonight, but I didn't hear from many of them yet, is really what the pitfalls were when they were putting together a policy, and how successful have they been with the policy. So you're able to pull up their entire policy, but for example, let's just talk about Baltimore Public Schools. So next slide, Kara. So Baltimore Public Schools, and I just picked their key pieces, but if you go on the folder, I believe it was shared with you, there is their policy, but then there's also their plan. And a couple of things that really stood out to me in their plan, in their policy, was the accountability piece. So that democratic principle of accountability, where somebody is coming and actually reporting to the board on the work that is being done. And I chose this one to share because it talks about students again, develop environmental literate students. And I you know, in the research that I did with the schools, the work that I'm continuing to do to support sustainability across the US and some of the different groups that I participate in, this is what we talk about. Like within the Office of Teaching and Learning, for example, where are we ensuring that, you know, that we're involving students? And, you know, one of the things that is coming up obviously is with the bond and curriculum materials. And, you know, we're talking about how do we engage with middle school students? How do we engage students to look at some of the materials? How do we engage our high school students? We have our high school students helping us with the International Youth Leadership Council. And so there are some things that we're doing, not necessarily particular to a sustainability policy, but that piece has to be there. We have to make sure that we're involving the students every step of the way. And you'll also see it's there twice, right? Build student leadership. And so part of their sustainability plan is student leaders, either in schools or across the district. You'll see engaged school communities. So they actually have a policy and a plan that I included in the folder. And then of course they brought the other pieces of the pillars, reducing natural resources. You have improving school green spaces, that would do with the health and wellness. And then the third pillar really has to do with environmental literacy. Next slide. And so Austin, their sustainability framework is a little bit different, hits some of those same pieces of all of the frameworks. So the piece that I really liked about this framework when I saw it was that you had teaching and learning, you had infrastructure and operations, and the community and culture. And I didn't talk about this. There's some research recently that's been done around having a sustainability director or a director of sustainability in districts, somebody that works within these three departments. So in Portland Public Schools, that would look like, you know, someone that works with Office of Teaching and Learning, OSP, facilities, and also with the schools. And the idea that districts have put in, and one of the examples is San Francisco and Sacramento both have this position, is to ensure that students are part of what is happening. So here you'll see they're working on the 4 areas: energy, purchasing, water, transportation, air quality, nature, food, and waste. Their policies also included in the folder. Next one. And so I didn't find a little graphic for San Francisco, but you'll see where their pillars, they call them sustainability pillars. And so they're talking about carbon neutrality. And it's in the policy and in some of the work that they've done. But San Francisco is also has an agreement with the city of San Francisco as well, around some of this work. And that's a really key piece with many of the policies. There is a direct correlation. San Diego will be an example of that. San Diego Unified School District and the San Diego County also have policies in place that support one another. So you see here water resilience, zero waste, sustainable transportation, and again, that connection to nature. And that's where you're seeing the student impact, is the connection to nature. Next slide. So the next couple of slides, I just included some of the different references. I have lots more. I also uploaded many of the the resources and articles in the folder. Again, if there's something that somebody is interested in, you can go to the next slide. You can just go to the end where it says questions. But my initial thought when someone said, what's the national landscape of this, is to take a deeper dive into all of these policies. And so I think I've read now recently about 45 policies over the winter break, just to get a better sense. And really my lens was looking at the frameworks of the Green Ribbon, and many of these schools and or districts have been a recipient of the Green Ribbon Award. But the piece for me, the big learning as I did a deep dive into the research years ago and have continued to be part of different organizations, is the importance of organizational leadership. Those democratic principles that in the policy that would move forward is to ensure that organizational leadership or democratic principles is there. And that a recommendation would just simply be, from my hat of sustainability, is having a plan in place that would reflect one or more of the frameworks that put students at the center, which is also reflective of the visioning work that's happening in PPS. So like I said, I added some of those policies that I thought were most pertinent to share, and some different resources, and I can answer any questions. I've always been interested in this work as a principal. So it was kind of funny when I said I would do this, because I think people just see me as the literacy person in the district. I don't consider myself an expert in anything. I do find myself to be quite centered on students. So I may be able to answer your questions. I might not, and I can always find the answer for you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, that was all of this information and all the materials you sent are, the materials were a little overwhelming, I gotta say. But it was the break. I was overwhelmed by.
How about thorough? They were thorough.
They were thorough, yes. And I think it would be, helpful. I don't know if everybody got a chance to read through all of them. And if you get new materials, because your peers are now coming back, you might want to send us other stuff. But I think it would be helpful for all of us on this committee to look at the other policies that are out there and see if we want to borrow or steal anything from them for our own policy. And this is just the beginning of our discussions on this policy. I'm a little hesitant to open it up to a lot of questions, because we do have public testimony and it's now 6:50. So how about we do 5 minutes for questions, with the understanding that there'll be more, just not today. Any questions?
So I don't have any, I have a lot of questions, but I think what I would find most useful, knowing that this is going to be a longer discussion, is I think it's really important that we start with an accurate picture of where we are. Like what is our carbon footprint? What's our sustainability footprint? Where are we trying to go? Because I think unless we have an accurate picture, it is really difficult to understand like where we're on the right track and where we actually need to make adjustments or provide some policy direction. So that's one thing. So going forward, I think that would be a good baseline for us to have. The second thing is, for me, a framework that would be, I found the part of the discussion, the presentation interesting on student related. Really, as a school-based, I also think there are lots of district-based things, whether it is transportation, investment policy, CTE offering, that really is at a district level. And so, which is where I think the board probably should focus. So I'm interested in thinking through how do you divide those, not divide them up, but how do they complement each other, and where's more of the board and district staff lane versus building those practices at the school-based level. So that's just my initial thinking about it.
So I would suggest, in a lot of schools and districts have done this, is that so part of the green ribbon, so part of the U.S. Department of Education is the application for the green ribbon, which is around the 3 pillars. So what many schools will do is they'll take the application. This is actually a suggestion that we give them when we're working with schools, is start with that application and fill it out. And therefore it will give you your baseline, because it will ask you, like, where are you at with waste reduction and recycling and CO2 and so forth. So to get an accurate picture of where we are as a district, actually completing that application that is available online, I probably just drop it in the folder for you, is really a great starting point, because it does talk to that. It's like, this is where we currently are at. And I won't overwhelm you anymore, but I do have all 595 applications currently that have won the Green Ribbon Award. So there are plenty of examples to see what other people are doing, but really, you know, we using that as a baseline, so it can say, well, this is currently, you know, where we're at. And I hear you, Julia, about the students, and so I bring that up because, yeah, there's some place for students to be leading things, but there's also opportunities for leaders in the district to ensure that they're keeping students at the center, especially like when you brought up CTE offerings, right? Like, what offerings do we have for students around green jobs and so forth?
So I have a little different perspective from Julia. I think I would agree with her that it's important to get that baseline. But that's more for the implementation of the policy and not necessarily the policy itself. And then subsequently for budgeting and action, we've talked before about what's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of, for example, reducing our carbon footprint. Gets back to that baseline measures of where we are. But the policy itself, I think, has to be, more encompassing, and even, you know, make sure that we keep doing what we're doing well, and not neglect what we're doing well to focus on something where we're not doing well, or could be doing better on. So not disagreeing with your points, but to me, it's a different framework when we're talking about our policy. So I'm just excited to dive into all a number of the examples that you gave us, Tanya, and see how we can strengthen. I think we already have a really, really good draft. And if there's more that we can bring in from what other districts have done to make it an even better policy going forward, that's a tremendous resource that you brought in for us.
Okay,
Go ahead, Rita.
But we should probably transition to public.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop here in order to make sure that we end on time and still have time for testimony. So I'll just say thank you again, and I'm sure we'll talk at great length in future meetings, plural. So thank you again for everything. And I think we have 2 people signed up for public testimony.
Yes. We have Mike Rosen.
Hasn't Mike used up all his slots for the year? That was a joke.
Hi, everyone. I in the 15 months that we've been working on this policy, one of the things that we've heard clearly from the community and the feedback we've gotten is to be more specific and do more. And we've looked at a lot of the policies and plans and resolutions, and we've looked at all the ones that were presented tonight. And it's pretty clear to me that the work around the country is not very comprehensive. We have a small set of resolutions here, policies and plans, and none of them are deep or wide. And I think PPS needs to really think about taking a leadership role. The city is moving forward really quickly through their climate emergency declaration and a new funding mechanism to fund the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability to implement it. And I think that we've got a lot of information and a lot of opportunity, and I just encourage the district to look within in terms of the work it's already doing and could be doing, and not spending so much time looking at what's happening around the country, because not much is happening. Thanks.
Thank you. We have Jane Kamal.
Hi there, thank you. I'm also, I've worked with Mike Rosen and Amy Higgs, the Executive Director for the Eco School Network, on this draft plan, for those of you who I haven't met before. And just adding on to what Mike said, I want to assure you that we reviewed all these documents and more that we talked about tonight, and we also drafted the policy around the whole school sustainability framework. So a lot of the things that Tanya talked about tonight, I think we could feel really good about the draft policy reflecting those different pillars and elements. Also, just as an aside, the U.S. Green Building Council and Center for Green Schools awarded the Eco School Network, the local organization, a national award in 2020. And the Eco School Network also supported training of one of PPS's teachers at Woodlawn Elementary. She led their school in Green Ribbon Schools process. So we do have some depth here in PPS, and I liked how some of the stuff that we're already doing has been highlighted. And by we, I mean PPS in our school communities. So I also think that, or I've appreciated what I've heard from school board directors around commitments to action on climate change and environmental justice. And I just think this is a real opportunity to lead. I think other school districts across the country are going to follow this same path that we have. And I hope that after the board adopts a climate action policy, that other school districts will come and look to Portland as the gold standard for best practice. Thank you.
Thank you. That's everybody we have signed up.
Okay, well, we have 1 minute left. Any additional comments for the good of the order? Okay, I think we did a lot today. Timing was a little bit off, unfortunately, but I think we made progress. So we will no doubt talk about this policy again in future meetings, yet to be determined. And thank you, everybody, for your attention and hard work today. So thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Do we have a suggested timeline for the climate policy in terms of when we want it ready to go? Remind me again.
We do. I don't have the thing in front of me.
Yeah. Okay. I've got it. It's a new year. I'm back from break. I've forgotten everything. That's right. We do have a draft schedule. I'll look it up. Never scratch that.
I'd like to be involved in any discussions that happen between the meetings, and also if we have any of the baseline information or the green schools application, to have that shared with me, if that's possible.
Well, can I, yeah, I'm sure I think we've already gotten some of the information about the baseline info. As I recall, it needs to be updated.
Didn't we just, wasn't there an update of the matrix in the materials in the board book?
Yes, yes, you're right. Sorry, there was. Yes, overwhelmed. Sorry. So we do have a subcommittee for this policy, and the board representatives are Scott and I. So we can keep you apprised of developments, Julia. I don't think we have, I think we've only met once as a subcommittee. But I'm sure, you know, as we get moving, we'll be meeting more often. Anyway. Okay, anything else? We're now at 7:02. Okay, I'm going to call it then. Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year. Let's hope it actually warrants the title of happy.